Read Parshas Yisro. Yisro was the father of Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe fled initially after he killed the Egyptian. He spent many years in Midian. If he fled when he was 18 and he didn't return till he was 80, he spent a good part of his life in Midian. Yisro was his father-in-law. Yisro took him as a son-in-law. So he was exposed to Moshe Rabbeinu for many years, and evidently valued him. Because when his daughters originally, they had come back early, he had said to them, why did you come back soon? So he said there was an Egyptian man who had fought off the attackers and he watered the sheep. So he said to them, why don't you bring him home? Maybe he'd marry one of you. So Yisro immediately appreciated that Moshe was a special person. So we see he had a keen eye for something of quality. Just leave it at that now. There's an obvious question. It says, Vayishma Yisro Kohen Midian Chosin Moshe. Yisro, the Kohen Midian, the Sheik of Midian, the father of Moshe, is Kol Asher Ose Elokim LaMoshe U'Yisrael Amo. All that Hashem had done to Moshe and Yisrael, his people, Ki Hotzias Yisrael Mitzrayim, that he took Yisrael out of Egypt. Okay? First, look, why do we need all this identification? Vayishma Yisro. We know Yisro, who Yisro was. When Yisro had taken Moshe as his son-in-law. And we know that he was the Kohen Midian. But yet, when we speak about he had heard what Hashem had done, he's identified as Kohen Midian, Chosein Moshe. That is the introduction. Who heard? Yisro Kohen Midian, who was the Chosein Moshe. All that Hashem had done to Moshe Yisrael Amo, that he took Yisrael out of Egypt. The obvious question is, firstly, what did he hear? So Rashi cites the Gemara. What drew his interest that he should abandon all his glory and go into the desert? You heard about the splitting of the sea and the war with the Amalek. Those two events had such an impact on Yisro, moved him to such a degree that he abandoned all his glory to come out into the desert to convert to become a Jew. He became part of Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people. What he heard, everybody heard. The whole world was aware of Kriyas Yamsuf. A good part of the world was aware of the battle with Amalek. How's it possible only one individual in the whole universe should be touched to such a degree and no one else was touched to this degree? And Yisro had quite a bit to give up. He was the Sheik of Midian. He abandoned everything. It's worthwhile. Not one other person other than Yisro gave up or was willing to make that change. Why? Evidently, Yisro had something which no one else had. What capacity, what clarity did Yisro have which no one else had? It's an obvious question. I mentioned last week, if you read the Oz Yoshir, we read in the Oz Yoshir, Moshe Rabbeinu says after the sea closed on the Egyptians and destroyed the Egyptian armies, in Perek Tezvov, Posuk Yudalid, Shomu Amrim Yugozun, the nations heard about Kriyas Yamsuf Yugozun. They became overwhelmed with fear. Chil Ochaz Yoshi Ploshes. Those who dwelt in Ploshes, that's the Philistine area, they were overwhelmed with a more intense level of fear. As Niflu Alufi Edom, the princes of Edom became overwhelmed with confusion. They were terrified. Eli Moav, the powerful ones of Moav, Yosei Murad, they were overtaken with trembling. No Mogul Kol Yishrei Canaan, all the inhabitants of Canaan, they just melted. They literally were actually incapacitated from the event. And yet, being affected to such a degree, their lives being totally disrupted, this upheaval, mentally, emotionally, not one of them came to become a Jew. How's it possible? Similar question. But nobody came. So we read when closer we're at the Yam Suf, it says, Zeh Keli Van Veyu. Zeh, this is my God, I will extol him. So over there, Rashi cites the Midrash, Masharosa Shivcha Ayam Leroy Yecheskel. What the maidservant, the lowly maidservant, saw at the splitting of the sea, even Yecheskel Hanovi, who was one of the greatest prophets, did not see what she saw. Now, what did she see? What did Yecheskel not see? So we explained what she saw was Malchus Shamayim. She saw God's majesty. As we say every night, Birchas Kriya Shema, Malchuscha Ruvanecha Bokeh Yom Lefnei Moshe. Your children had seen your kingship when Moshe split the sea. What was the response? Malchuscha Ruvanecha Bokeh Yom Lefnei Moshe Zeh Keli Anu V'Yamru. They said, this is my Keli. Anu V'Yamru Hashem Yimloch L'Olam Ved. When they saw God's majesty, they said Hashem's should reign forever. His kingdom should reign forever. So what did the Shivcha see? What did Klal Yisrael see? They had seen God's majesty. The world didn't see God's majesty. The event that took place, it totally incapacitated them. It brought a level of fear and worry and trembling where they couldn't function. But who is God? What is God? They have no idea. Klal Yisrael saw God firsthand, up front. They saw his majesty. They saw something there's nothing in existence which is the equivalent of this. That's something they want to be part of. The world doesn't know what it is. I'd once mentioned the name of Chaim Volozhiner, which it's cited in the introduction to the Igeres HaGra. We find that the greatest prophet among Jews who ever existed was Moshe Rabbeinu. Lo kam novi b'Yisrael k'Moshe. So the inference is b'Yisrael k'Moshe, b'bein umas ha'olam. But among the nations of the world, there was a Navi who was great as Moshe. Who was that? This Bilam. Bilam had in one aspect of his being, he had a level of clarity similar to Moshe. It's obvious he wasn't Moshe. I mean, man who could commit bestiality. He lived with his donkey and represent evil to that degree. And if we get to Bullock, he believed he could deceive God. He could mislead God. So evidently it's clear. He didn't have an appreciation, understanding of God the way Moshe understood God. But there was a certain sense of clarity he had, which was similar to Moshe. So Reb Chaim Volozhiner explains, and I want you remember when he gives the allegory, he says you have an eagle and you have a bat. When an eagle flies, it's able to see hundreds of miles. From the altitude, it flies. When it sees the sun, the rays of the sun deflecting off the earth, it allows it to see hundreds of miles. That's the expression eagle-eyed. A bat cannot see. But the bat's sensitivity to light is at a level that when it senses light, it goes into the deepest recesses of a cave not to be exposed to light. Does a bat know what light is? A bat doesn't know what light is. But it has a sense, it's something, when it's the moment it appears, it flees, because it senses it. It doesn't know what it senses. Moshe Rabbeinu is the equivalent of the eagle. He had a clarity. He saw God up front, so to say, to the capacity maximum that a human being is able to. That's Lokom Novi B'Moshe, B'Yisro K'Moshe. Bilam had a sense, he knew exactly the moment of God's wrath. He knew exactly when to curse the Jews. That's similar to the bat. Similar here. The nations of the world, what they saw, they heard something which is terrifying, incapacitating, overwhelmingly, you can't coexist with it. What is it? They had no idea what it was. They knew it's power. Power, they know it's something of power. Klaus, it was more than they saw power. They saw God's majesty. Okay? Therefore, Klal Yisrael, when it came to Sinai, we explained last week, when the world was offered the Torah and Hashem offered the Torah, what did they say? It's not our cup of tea. It doesn't conform with our lifestyle. Lo tirtzach, whatever it may. When Klal Yisrael was offered the Torah, we said Nasa v'nishma. After seeing God's majesty, of course, what's the question? We don't even have to ask what it is. We accept it unequivocally. So the question is, what about Yisro? Yisro wasn't that Kriyas Yamsuf. So what was the impetus and the overwhelming draw that Yisro gave everything to come into the desert? He should be no different than nations of the world. The fear, the trembling, the awesomeness of the event, but he didn't see God's majesty, Yisro. Now, you read the story when Moshe fled to Midian and he fought off the attackers, and his daughters came home early, and he says, what happened? He says, an Egyptian man saved us from our attackers. He says, why don't you bring him home? Evidently, maybe he'd marry one of you people. So the Maral of Prague asks, what did Yisro notice so special in Moshe Rabbeinu that he was qualified to marry one of his daughters, and he should marry one of his daughters? So Maral explains in the Guras Hashem, a man who puts his life in jeopardy, he fights off the attackers, waters the flocks, even though he doesn't want any compensation for his efforts. But a person who has some degree of ego, he minimally wants to inform the person who owns those flocks who actually provided the service. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't even follow them home. By the way, I'm the one who did that. Or even not saying it, just present himself that the person minimally should have an appreciation for who the person who put himself out to provide the service or this protection. Moshe Rabbeinu stayed behind. Yisro, being a statesman, having an understanding of what quality of person is, he never in his life experienced such a person. Immediately, he identified him, he's one of a kind. Because it's unheard of. Minimally, you should come back and just identify who you are. Even if you don't want compensation. Now, Yisro, why did he have such an appreciation for quality? Why? But factually he did, as the Maral points out. Let's get back to the very beginning. Paro had 3 advisors. Yisro, Bilam, Eov. Who was the one who suggested the bondage? The final solution, so to say. To put the cap on the Jewish people, ultimately to destroy them. That was Bilam. And Paro actually embraced that solution. So the Gemara tells us, Yisro, when he heard this, he fled in protest. He could not tolerate this miscarriage of justice, this terrible cruelty. How do you enslave a people whose family saved the day? Yosef was the viceroy. Innocent people, they've never done anything. This paranoia, how could you, it's the equivalent of taking an innocent people, destroying them. How do you do it? Yisro could not tolerate that. Eov Shosak, Eov remained silent. Job remained silent. Even though Job was a tzaddik, somehow he's able to reconcile it. But openly he did not, publicly he did not make the protest. Bilam is evil. Eov is a tzaddik, but he could coexist with this kind of behavior. Yisro could not tolerate it. He could not be there regardless of the consequences. He's out of there. He fled. But you realize Paro is the monarch of the most powerful civilization. You're going to fall out of his good favor, his good graces. Doesn't make a difference. I cannot be associated with any such action. I'm out of here. I protest. So Yisro, you see, initially had a capacity, or had no capacity to tolerate this kind of evil. So because he had that capacity to understand what goodness is, what happened when he saw a man like Moshe Rabbeinu? He says, this man is the husband for my daughters. Okay? Once he takes Moshe as a son-in-law, and he spends 60 years with him in his home, you know what it means to be exposed to Moshe Rabbeinu for 60 years? 60 years. Tov l'tzadik, tov l'shcheno. It's good for the tzaddik by osmosis. You become a different person. Your whole, whatever his qualities were, even though they weren't developed, but exposed to Moshe Rabbeinu, you reach a whole level different understanding. You touched endless times over. And then after all the years, he comes to his father and says, God came to me at the burning bush and said I should return to redeem the Jewish people. So to say, Yisro had, the inside scoop. He had the inside scoop, all this whole orientation. And finally, Moshe tells him, I'm going back. Because God said, I'm going back. I must, as the Redeemer, to redeem the Jewish people. And he gave his blessing. Go. Now, after everything, here's the splitting of the sea. He has all the background to fully internalize and appreciate. Although he wasn't there at the sea, he didn't see God's majesty, but he had a sufficient capacity that nothing is the equivalent of this. I'm giving it all up to go into the desert. The world didn't have all this background, regardless who they were. It was purely fear. Fear a person doesn't make. Once you allay that fear, a person feels he's a safe haven, he continues living his life the way he lived it before. Therefore, to abandon the glory, as long as it doesn't touch us, we have no reason to make changes in our life. Therefore, they remained where they were. Yisro gave it all up to go out to the desert to become a Jew.